A peace in the Middle East meeting was prohibited from taking place in Germany last week after Berlin police banned the event from happening on its planned date, Friday, October 13th, and said the holding of any replacement event in Berlin is prohibited until October 19th. The police said an examination by the Assembly Authority has shown that there is an imminent danger the Assembly will have seditious, anti-Semitic explanations, a glorification of violence, conveying a willingness to use violence and thereby intimidation and violent activities.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald responded to this news, writing, exactly as happened with COVID and then with the war in Ukraine, the multi-pronged censorship scheme the Western governments have implemented has been once again activated, again to a shockingly new level, to ban dissent from EU policy on the Israel-Gaza war. Glenn added, the censorship justification is always the same. The banned views or protests are hate speech. The banned views incite hatred against a vulnerable minority. Allowing these views mean people die. Many who mock these are now cheering the EU and big tech censorship. Now, this, of course, comes after France banned all pro-Palestinian protests in the country. And journalist Glenn Greenwald joins us now to weigh in. Glenn, we are so happy to have you back with us. Thank you for being here and, talk to us about these threats we're seeing to free speech and civil protest all over the globe, but in Western countries that reminds me and probably reminds you of how readily and easily civil liberties were abandoned in the U.S. as a response to what happened on 9/11.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right framework. Obviously, after 9/11, most Americans, I know I was included among them, I lived in Manhattan at the time, felt a sense of great rage over the attacks that had been perpetrated that killed 3,000 American civilians. Most decent people, by definition, felt similarly about the attacks that Hamas carried out in Israel on Saturday. And yet the lesson that I thought we had learned from 9/11 is that when we follow our rage and we allow the government to claim authoritarian powers, enact the Patriot Act days later because everybody's so angry and they can exploit that, we end up going down paths that we find at best counterproductive and in many ways shameful. I think the key here, Robbie, is that the EU, these EU governments, Germany, France, have taken a position in this war. They are on the side of Israel. They have made that abundantly clear. And note that they're not banning all protests regarding this war. They're only banning protests that are either critical of Israel or pro-Palestinian, meaning protests that are a deviation from their policies. You're still free to have pro-Israel protests. You're allowed to call for the destruction of Gaza. What you're not allowed to do are have the kind of protests where you express views that dissent from government policy. And that's what I think makes this so alarming.
Glenn, you've also been tracking some, I loathe to talk about hypocrisy, but some backtracking that some prominent critics of these kind of speech overreaches have been doing in the wake of this particular conflict. People like you, I will say my co-host here, and Michael Schellenberger have been very consistent on these issues, but not everyone has been the same way. Who, in your view, have been sort of the biggest offenders here?
Well, it's just so interesting because over the last 4 to 5 years, censorship has become a primary weapon of the neoliberal elites or the American liberal left. The kind of entire Democratic Party has defended things like the U.S. security state pressuring big tech to censor on COVID, on Ukraine, on Russiagate, and now in this war. And conservatives have been almost unanimously united against this sort of thing, which is why I found myself in alignment with them on these issues. And I have a lot of experience arguing with left liberals who defend these censorship policies, invoking the rationale that you guys started off the segment by detailing, the ones that I outlined. And now I find myself seeing conservatives overtly cheering, not just the censorship that they have been so loudly opposing over the last few years, but the theories invoked to justify that censorship. One in particular is Dave Rubin, who basically really built his platform, his entire platform, in opposition to things like cancel culture and censorship. And he went in response to this news that France imposed a nationwide ban on all Palestinian protests and said, oh, maybe there's a chance for the West after all. As though, I guess now the way to save the West is by empowering neoliberal officials in France to ban political speech that they disagree with. And this is something you're seeing throughout the American right. Not all, by no means all, but a lot of people who typically mock cancel culture, mock the call for free speech, for censorship, now suddenly not just approving of it, but demanding it.
Yeah, that's a great example. More good examples, I thought, was the overreaction to the statements put out by the Harvard students, solely blaming Israel for what has happened. I criticized that statement. It's gotten a lot of criticism from people on the right, and I think it was fair to call those students out. Of course, that is free speech as well. But then there was an entire we're gonna blast their names all over everywhere. We're gonna make sure they can never get a job, anything of that sort. And then there's been a split on the right in whether that's the right approach. Megyn Kelly saying we should do that. Candace Owens and Vivek Ramaswamy saying, okay, wait a minute, isn't this the very cancel culture we decry? I feel similarly to you that there's so much hypocrisy on the kind of cancel culture ethos of free speech environment, and then certainly on the policies of free speech. These European governments, we cannot allow in the U.S. this kind of thing to take hold. I think our First Amendment prohibits it technically, but we've seen all the ways American government bureaucrats have used to get around the very hard protections, firm protections of the First Amendment.
I think those are excellent examples. One that really bothered me in particular, because it's not just a pundit, but a fairly high-ranking government official, was Josh Hawley, who, like most conservatives or from that wing of the Republican Party, have been calling for things like defund the FBI, or at least insisting that they be investigated for their politicization of their powers. And Josh Hawley went and said, I want the FBI to investigate people who are signing petitions that he thinks go over the line. In other words, calling for the FBI to do things like COINTELPRO and the kinds of things that gave it such a bad name in the 60s and 70s, and now again during the Trump era, meaning not investigating crimes, but investigating people who have the wrong ideology. And I think the cancel culture thing on some level is also disturbing, though not as bad as when state officials do it. But you're exactly right, Robbie. I thought the whole point was, the leftists who want to get people fired really do believe those views are dangerous. They really believe those views incite violence against minorities. They feel just as strongly as people on the right who think that pro-Hamas statements should be made illegal or criticism of Israel should be made illegal. You either believe in the principle or you don't.
I wondered if you had any insight on this story that's been going around about 3 MSNBC Arab hosts being taken off the air. Of course, we both used to work with Mehdi Hasan at The Intercept. They seem not to have made any statements denying the veracity of the claim they were taken off the air. But MSNBC has pushed back, saying that Ali Velshi was traveling and that was the cause of him not doing his nightly show. People have wondered if Mehdi Hasan would make a statement. It doesn't seem like he has been willing to do so far, one way or another. And some people have taken that silence, his failure to reject the idea that he was intentionally pulled off, as speaking volumes. Do you have any insight there?
I think is one of the best journalists at MSNBC, and he has been incredibly insightful in a lot of his commentary. Brave as well. He went on the air right away when the climate was very kind of repressive, and he's one of the 3 who has reportedly been taken off the air. So I've spoken to some people in MSNBC, and I think the point you're making is exactly right, Bree. If I were the subject of news reports saying I had been censored by my corporate employer and it wasn't true, I, of course, would run forward to say this is not true. I wouldn't want people thinking I had been censored and I just swallowed it silently, because it's devastating to your credibility if that's true. If it is true, I would think it is even more disturbing that they are standing by silently and allowing it to happen without objecting. It is true these people have been on the air. They've been part of panels. They've been doing some reporting. The issue, though, is have they been removed from their hosting positions? They all have their own shows, either on the weekend or on streaming services. And it seems as though it is true that the shows they host, that they typically anchor, have not been airing. And I agree with you completely. They have the obligation as journalists to stand up and either say, yes, these reports are true, or they're not. And the fact that they're silent, I think, makes it even more alarming.
I wanted to get your take on another issue. I'm hearing a lot of mainstream reporters, the Ben Collins of the world from NBC, claiming misinformation has never been more out of control on social media on X than it is now. Even though I'm seeing, I remember a lot of erroneous fog of war reports, during other violent events, during shootings, during bombings, during natural disasters. They're saying it's the worst it's ever been. Although, I'm seeing community notes, which I think is a really actually good feature on X, correcting in some cases extremely quickly some of the bad information that's spreading. So, how do you respond to how social media and how mainstream media is handling what's going on right now?
So 2 points. This is historical revisionism. They're trying to say that ever since Elon Musk took over Twitter and got rid of content moderators, which is a euphemism for censors, that now there's this sudden flow explosion of disinformation. Anyone with a memory that's functioning very well recalls that these same media outlets were complaining about Facebook, Google, and Twitter prior to Elon Musk in the Jack Dorsey era, allowing way too much disinformation. They've always wanted more censorship, Robbie. They've always claimed that not censoring enough spawns disinformation. And I think the key thing with this term disinformation is who gets to decide what is disinformation. People like Ben Collins were the ones spreading the CIA conspiracy theories about Trump being subject to blackmail by Vladimir Putin because he had sex tapes he was holding over his head, or lying that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. These people are the least qualified people to decree what is and is not disinformation. And I think you're right. Letting the market decide, the kind of marketplace of ideas, either through community notes or responding, is by far a more effective way than trying to empower centralized authority to decree what is true and what is false, which is easily abused, and no one is competent to do that.
Thank you so much for weighing in on this, and people should continue to follow your coverage of it over on your show. Glenn, it's always such a pleasure.
Great to see you guys. Thanks for having me on.